Re-recording of week 5 for the practical. Apologies, this video is quite late. Doing what I can to stay on top of things, but yeah, clearly there's a bit of a backlog that I need to get through. So this week we had a look at a simple blacksmith scene with the intent of focusing on high poly modeling techniques. So for now I'm just going to go into the UV editing mode. Don't need an object, delete that one. The reason I'm in UV editing is so I can just grab our intended reference image, drag it in, and look at it that way. So there is the ways of bringing reference images into the scene as the front, back, side, left, whatever. Personal preference, I like how it was done in Blender 2.7 and earlier. Not a huge fan of the new way of doing it, so I'm just going to look at the image in the UV editing window and make the model here. So firstly, make sure you've watched the lecture video. Secondly, within Blender, obviously I'll need to turn on screencast keys as I do every week in every single window. Right, so there we go, that is on. Again, you don't need to do that, that's just so I can get the visuals showing up in the bottom left corner of the window. Thirdly, we're going to start with this front part. As per the lecture video, we'll be making a sort of a lower res outer mesh using subdivision surface to get the smoother mesh and marking edges as creases that should be of a sharper shape. So add mesh cylinder. Because this is going to be the front and it needs to be lower res, that'll just help our topology. If we change this to 12, that will be much more manageable when we get further into the object. Numpad keys for front, numpad 1 for front, numpad 3 for side, numpad 7 for top, numpad 5 to switch in and out of perspective. So if we go to the side view for now, rotate that 90 degrees, get this in the ballpark of correct scale. I noticed that for the overwhelming majority of assignment 1 models, the scale was largely ignored, so we had like 6 meter wide computer keyboards and things. In Blender, you won't really notice that in the viewport. In Unreal, when you start to make an actual game and import your 6 meter keyboard in, clearly it's going to either be done on purpose because you're remaking the Stanley Parable with all sorts of weird stuff, or it just won't look right. So, item scale 0.2 of a meter. So this here looks to be about 10 centimeters, maybe 15. So that's sort of getting in the right kind of area. Control A to apply the scale, Control A to apply the rotation. Now if we were to do Control A to apply the location, it'll set that back to 0, 0, 0. We don't necessarily need to do that step, but we will for this video. Also, it's going to be easier if I make this side the front, i.e. the pointy bit, because then our keyboard shortcuts will sort of line up more with the reference image. Also, as a UV unwrap, we don't need that at all at this point, because we're making the high res mesh that will bake any sort of surface detail down to a low res. So if we will go select this face here, scale it down, side view, bring it up. So that gives us our very basic triangular shape for the edge here. Because I did that from a side view, everything is centered. If you try and move things from a perspective view, chances are they'll be off to the side and skewed. So I'll just undo that back to how it was. So that's where we want it in 3D space. Now if we go modifier, add modifier, subdivision surface, we start to get our smoothing. If we bump this up to 3, we'll get a nice smooth result as we go. So this here is an N-gon, also viewport clipping 0.01, so we can get in nice and close to that. If we were to E to extrude, right click to cancel the move, so we've got that duplicate face there. S for scale, 0 to bring it in. This converts this n-gon into a sort of a fan of triangles. However, one more step, because as we can see from the bottom here, we've technically got 12 of 36 verts selected. So there's still all the overlapping vertices at that point. So we go wireframe mode, select those, and then right click, merge vertices at center. So now that's one vertex. What we can do with that, let's go to the side view, Z key, solid, and bring that out. If we were to add an extra edge loop in here, that can start to be sharper against that face. Don't bring it all the way in. And if we add another one partway through, what we can do is scale that. So that's scale and Z for Z axis to scale it in the one axis only. That's going to be a bit inflated at the top, but if we grab that back down, we now have our relatively flat top part, which we can select these edges here, S for scale, Z, and zero them out that way. Next thing we can see on our shape, sort of transitions into curved on the bottom through there. It does transition to a flat line, but it's much more of a squared off shape up the top. So to go from one to the other, we can take what we've got here, extrude that out. Because we've got that extra loop in there, we can sort of start the transition immediately. So grab these four, S for scale, scale those down, bring those up to meet the top. And then at the back here, we will just select these four edges, scale those down. In the side view, move them down to about there. These faces will also need to come up slightly to match in our side view, but not a whole lot. So what we can do now is either add in an extra edge loop, which is what I tend to favor doing these things, but the other way of doing that would be to cancel, remove that loop, and start using the mark sharp edges. So if I was to left click that one, control left click that one, and that one, we can do right click, mark edge crease. This will then let us move our mouse around. We can either move it to a spot where it looks like it's punched out, or we can just shortcut this and type in 1 on the number pad, which will make that 100% creased edge, and away we go. Similarly on the side, this one, this one, this one, scale, x-axis 0. This one, this one, this one, scale, x-axis 0. We've then got the beginnings of that shape. It does also need to transition on these edges here to being sharp up the top as well. So right click, edge crease, set that to 1. From there, keep on going, select that face at the back. As soon as we E to extrude that out, you'll notice that the edge creases don't necessarily follow along. Because we've created new edges, sometimes Blender will do its best to guess that you want edges following along. Usually it doesn't though, which is fine. It's doing what it can to interpret what you're telling it. These edges down the bottom here, again, just trying to keep that line going. Constrained to the Z-axis, so that's neat. However, this shape is also scaled a bit in the X and Y from the shape in front of it. Not a huge amount though, so more like that. E to extrude to bring that back out, and this sort of becomes the main bulky part of our anvil. So it's about now that we'd sort of clean up that back shape. Can do that by selecting this middle one, F for face, cut along the middle, face there, whoop, face there, and if you alt click the edge, it'll select the border of that hole and you F for face there. So if you do need to bring this line up to match the other lines exactly, what you can do is we want the height of that, so the Z coordinate, which we can see here is that. We can Control C to copy that, Control V to paste that, and that will bring those points up to that height. Don't need to consistently do this along your model, but it can help for neatness and accuracy, particularly when modeling more of a hard surface or mechanical object. So on the back here, we're going to need to have this curving in, transitioning into this being straight out and this being straight at the back here. So now that these are aligned, probably what we'll do is actually bring that back down to where that would be the base of the curve. Select these, subdivide, turn off the W select key because I keep hitting that. Number of cuts, if we bring that up to say 4, so we have got our n-gon on the side, so we'll need to make sure we go back and fix that later, because we can see the n-gon is creating unwanted pinching along the side there. So I'll go back to faces, select those, side view, grab on the y-axis, and then just this center one, grab on the y-axis and bring those in. So we've got our curve at the base there. These ones here, we can E to extrude, about like that. And then just bring the bottom edges back up. Again, this is all now quite soft. We're going to need to put our edge creases back in. It's up to you as to whether you do each edge crease immediately after you've done some of the modeling, or whether you get comfortable enough with subdivision modeling that you can just sort of do a pass on the model and then do a pass on the creases and then make any tweaks as you go. A bit of both is generally good to keep an eye on the overall shape of the model. So now that we've got those selected, we can also Shift Alt left click to select other edge loops that are going to need to be sharp, keeping in mind that selecting this edge loop has gone all the way to the front, which we don't want. So C for circle select. We can remove these from the selection. Control S for save. We're also going to want these side ones. This one. Again, you don't have to get all of these at the same time. It's just going to make the demonstration a bit clearer for what's going on. Also, to pay closer attention, it seems that the sharper edge does get smoothed out here, so we'll probably deselect that one and that one. Then we do right click, edge crease, drag it out. So again, this base is still going to need fixing. Even though this is an n-gon here, that has pretty much fixed the pinching on the sides there. And again, that's a way that subdivision surface modeling even, is working, because this here, regardless of how many sort of polygons are going on underneath it, is considered to be flat. So all I did there was turn on this last step of the modifier. That will just show us the end result shape. and optimal display, if we were to turn that off, used to show the individual wireframe. Apparently does not do that anymore. That's fantastic. Okay, only in that mode, but not with the cage mode on cage turned on. So that's just a way of seeing we've got the Ngon being split into these quads. The topology there is getting a bit messy, but because, like I said, this is all being treated as flat. Back in solid mode, anything that's flat only really cares about the outer surface, so the topology within that. It's good from a workflow point of view to keep that clean, but that's all going to come out flat with a subdivision modifier on because it's all polys in the one plane. Anyway, moving right along. What we will do before I go any further is actually deal with that Ngon so I don't forget later on. If we were to cut an edge loop, so Control R to bring that there, you'll notice the edge loop doesn't go all the way sort of down to the base. Sorry, just thinking aloud here. Control R, edge loop, we'll leave that in the center. So now if we deselect all, select these edges down the bottom, right click, subdivide, and just the one is fine. We can now select this face and this one, delete those deliberately. So we've just got our one quad here, our one quad here, and we can have this edge and this edge joined. So this is now a quad and a quad. Again, making sure we make use of that on both sides. And then what we can do here is F to fill that in. That's an Ngon again. Control T will split it into triangles. So now we've at least got quads on the bulk of that shape. That is then transitioning into more edge loops for the back, so we can define the curve of it there. But once we get down to the base of the anvil, this is all in quads again, so we can continue to model on knowing that those edge loops will be clean. So again, to demonstrate that, select all the edges, so Alt left click, F to fill it in, Control T to turn it into triangles. So now we've got our base, which we can make sure we're in side view. E to extrude down. So you'll notice following this curve along that it gets flat, it tapers out a bit to the front, and then it tapers again to broaden out to the side. So there's a couple of steps going on here, but we can see that once it gets to this point here, it's still joined in the center. So we can select these, side view, S for scale, only want them in the Y axis to get that tapered part out to the front, which is mirrored somewhat on the back. Bring that a little in. So extrude these down. So what we've got is our four sort of components. If we E to extrude, shift select these, E to extrude. So after the extrude, I'm cancelling the move. So we do have our extra faces. I'm just leaving them where they are. E to extrude, right click, cancel the move. E to extrude, right click, cancel the move. And of course that is showing up over the top of screencast keys. So now with those selected, wireframe mode to show what's going on. If we move these back, control to constrain in the axis, I can tell I've moved them back 0.05 of a meter. Just bring that out to 0.06, so 6 centimeters if you will. and can bring this out, say 0.3, looks about right. What we then do is match that on the others, so bring it back 0.5, bring it over 0.4, yep, okay, 0.4 on both sides apparently, I decided. Solid, to see them, select them, wireframe, 0.4 out this way, 0.5 that way, yep, and one more. The measurements are showing up in the top left of the viewport in case you can't see that. So they were up here, a little hard to point to with the mouse while moving it, but that's the area to look in. So, like I said, Blender has guessed where we want some of these edges to be, or where we want them to be sharp. Probably going to make it easier on ourselves if we just go to wireframe mode, select all of these, right click, edge, nope, edge mode, right click, edge crease. Now we can either drag them to all be 1 or drag them to all be 0. For now I'm going to make them all 0, or you can type in -1, which will clear all creasing altogether. This will also need a bit of scaling down. So Alt left click on those edges, except for these center vertices. So we'll also just grab the actual bottom verts, but not these two in the middle. That's because this is slightly raised as opposed to the rest of it. So if we scale that down, move that down slightly, so we're sort of following that edge along. Of course, if we were taking photos of the anvil ourselves, we would be able to make sure we had more of a direct side-on, front-on, all the various views for the reference. We're just sort of ad-libbing a bit because we've got the one main reference photo from a perspective view. And we'll see that these are much further apart, so these end bits are much narrower. So if we select those, scale, constrain to the y-axis, and bring those out more to match. So we are getting there on the anvil. So from here, you can either do the edge creasing again. It may actually just be quicker to add in a couple of loops, but also for me to showcase both sides of the process. This is still going to be curved in the center here. So we're going to want to pull that back. Sort of the easiest way to do that is to just, a little issue with the selection here. Alt left click those edges, Alt left click these connecting ones, so it's the entire loop around the bottom, right click, edge crease, bring that all the way in. So now we've got our sharp going that way. We want the sharps continuing around those there, those edges there, making sure that doesn't connect back onto the parts that we want smooth for the actual smoother part of the anvil. Right click, edge crease, drag them out. Now this at the front and the back, I've still got that tapered in, but if we go to our wireframe mode, this is this far forward in Y, so we can select our 1, 2, 3 edges there, paste that in Y, which will bring it out to the front, and do the same on the back here. Dipping in and out of wireframe in solid mode is pretty common. Of course, we needed to select this and copy the Y value first. Bring that out there. So at the moment this curves inwards, and we've got ours sort of curving basically the inverse of what we actually want. So if we grab these and make them sharp for starters, edge crease 1, so we're going to need to add a loop in there, a loop in there, you've guessed it folks, loop in there, just make sure I didn't screw up the symmetry, and a loop in there. So now if we just want these inner edges, so can grab 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, nope, wrong 9, 10, work with me, 10, 11, 12, S for scale, Y, and scale those out. So now it comes to our level flat part in the center. The curve goes back inwards. We can actually scale these in a bit in X as well to be sure. And we've got a little bit of an issue up the front here, which is mirrored on the back. So what we can do to fix that is, instead of this edge going lengthways, we can delete that edge, F to add a face, go into wireframe view to show this off a little clearer. So now we've got two quads up the top and a triangle down the bottom. Not necessarily what we want, but for this particular shape it should work. If we were to select just this edge, right click, subdivide. So that might not immediately look like it's done anything, but this edge is now two edges. F for face, F for face. And from a subdivision modeling point of view, that has fixed it. There's still a little bit of a curve where it's not particularly straight, so I mean ideally you'd go back and have one loop flowing along there and one loop flowing along on the top. Which we can do by selecting these two, right click, subdivide. It's giving us an awkward shape in the middle, but we can right click, merge. Of course it's all change the context, right click, merge at center. So now we've got a vert where we need it, but faces where we don't. Basically what I'm trying to achieve here is we were getting some jankiness across this line, but if this line is a flat single line that goes all the way across, we should be able to remove any sort of pinching we were having. Back into solid mode. There we go, sorted. And just to quickly do that on the back, so delete that edge. Right click, subdivide. There's in two different bits. Control T to triangulate. F to make a face, F to make a face. Right click. Merge, center. Back in wireframe. F to make an edge. W because I keep selecting that accidentally. Subdivide. Connect up our faces. Fantastic. So that is our anvil, more or less. The second part of the practical, which we covered. A little bit of pinching here, so you might need to go in and tidy up a few of those edge creases. That's going to be less of what we want. The quickest way to actually fix that would be to select all the faces on this side, which looks like that in wireframe. Do that on the other side. E to extrude, S to scale, X ever so slightly, which has caused as many issues as it solved. But we can fix them reasonably quickly. I missed a couple of faces, which did not help. Just making sure I have that bottom loop as well. So some edge loops it's easier to cut in, some edge loops it's easier to extrude sections out, which is what we're about to do here. So E for extrude, S for scale, and then any edges in the corners we're going to need to fix as well. So that one, that one, that one, that one. And this was to fix the pinching at the front where we had a diagonal edge going into a straighter edge. So we need to fix that one, that one. What's going on there? Fantastic. Oh, did I scale that? E to extrude, S for scale, X for that axis. Right. So it might just really be these top ones. Unlimited undo is, well, not unlimited. 32 steps of undo is very, very handy. So what if we just grab these to increase those? No, that's not what we want either. Grab this line and just simply move it back. More or less. We cut an extra one in there. Hold A to deselect, B to border select, G for grab, Y to move back a bit in that axis. There we go. So yeah, it can be a bit of back and forward between what's the easiest way to fix any sort of pinching like that. But yeah, we've got our basic anvil shape. In the prac we did also have a look at the tree stump. So Shift A, add mesh cylinder, scale that down, Alt G to bring it back to the center of the scene. Anvil we can bring up a bit, so that would be sitting effectively where a ground plane is. Now H for hide, we don't need that for now. So we've got our cylinder. The bottom won't be needed. We can delete that. What we're going to have a look at for this particular object, as well as obviously doing the add modifier subdivision surface, bump up the samples here, is a technique called displacement mapping. So displacement mapping will take a grayscale image, any image really, but it's taking the brightness of that image and using the darker parts of the image to push polygons in, and brighter parts of the image to push polygons out. So for a model like this, we can E to extrude, S to scale, right click under vertices or edges, do merge at center. For displacement mapping to work nicely, we're going to need a fairly even distribution of polygons. So if we right click there, do subdivide, add in a couple of cuts, so that each face is, where possible, a sort of a roughly square sort of a shape. So on the sides, we need to add in a couple of loops, so it's roughly square there as well. And being a tree stump, we will need to sharpen up that edge somewhat. Right click, edge crease, bring that to 1. So, if I was to do add modifier displace, we would be able to get a result, but the best result here will be done with some UV mapping. Seems like a lot of students are still having issues with UV unwrapping, and thanks to YouTube's analytics, I can tell exactly how many of you have actually gone back and watched the practical recap videos for those weeks. Obviously for the external students, that is the primary way they're able to view that content, but for the rest of you, it may be worth going back and having a look at some of that content again. So if we were to do right click, mark seam, this is now an edge creased edge and a UV seam edge. We will also mark a UV seam down the side here, right click, mark seam, and we don't need to do anything else to the base because there isn't one. We got rid of it. So the sphere will have its default UV unwrap. Just clear our reference image for now. So the stuff on the side is almost how we want it anyway, but we'll do U, unwrap. Don't actually want it to do its thing and rotate stuff. So we want to rotate that. UV, pack islands, bring up that option, rotate is turned off. We actually want to scale that, bring it up so it's using most, if not all, of the texture space there. So that means we've unwrapped the sides, and it's using the entire sort of texture space. So if we were to image open, or in this case I'm just going to drag it in from Windows Explorer, tree bark displace, which is part of the week 5 files, being a square image and these being squared in the actual viewport but stretched here, what we're actually going to do is S for scale until those are basically square, so we sort of end up 3 to 1 in terms of a aspect ratio sort of thing. So we'll do add modifier displacement now, displace being 4th one down, 3rd column, add texture, use the UVs. Currently it's doing nothing. If we tab back out of edit mode into object mode, you'll see it's punched that all in. So we have a texture called texture. If we do bark displace, when we go into our texture panel here, so the last icon down, from our drag and dropped images we can tell that to be tree bark displace, and we get a fuzzy sort of pine cone. Not what we want. So for starters, that displacement strength is too strong. Should be around 0.05, just to be more subtle, or 0.1 even. We're also going to need more polygons to make this work. So at the moment, this is a subdivision level of 2, 3, 4, 5. As we get higher and higher, we can start to see what this is actually doing on the mesh. If we go to 6, we'll start to see that the outer surface of the mesh is being pushed in the pattern of this bark texture. Depending on your machine, you may not want to go higher than 6. Blender has a soft limit of 6, but if we type in 7 ourselves, just to force Blender that we know what we're doing, this will give us enough polys to make that work. And we can see we get our lovely sort of bark shape on the sides. Being a modifier, and again, just a flag, this is now over 2.5 million polys. So again, keep an eye on your machine. On laptops, this might be too high, depending on what spec sort of machine you have. Because this is a modifier, if we were to tab into edit mode, and things may start to slow down for you at this point, if we were to scale this bottom edge out, and maybe a little bit more of the one above it, tab back into object mode, that texture has followed the subdivision surface, because we've got subdivision surface as the first modifier, displacement is the second one. If we were to swap the order of these modifiers around, which I can just do to show you, it appears to do absolutely nothing, because displace is the first one, there's not enough polys for it to do its thing, and then subdivision just makes a whole lot of extra edges and faces on top of that. So always subdivision first, displacement second. This gets us part the way there for our tree stump. So the next concept to get across is that of vertex groups. So if we were to go to our object data properties, so the little green triangle, vertex groups is the first one along, there's nothing there. We can add a group, call this bark sides. Now if we go into edit mode, we can select all the verts on the sides, assign them, go back to our modifier, tell that to only affect bark sides, and now that will only affect our edge loops on the sides here. So next step, we might want to add a couple of extra edge loops in there and remove that one there. So now if we were to go back into object mode, there's still a bit of bleed in from that there, but scale that to be closer to the outer edge. About like so. Completely remove this from bark sides and make sure these are removed from bark sides as well. So that'll force the bark displacement to smooth off a bit, but also really only affect right up to that edge. And then this top part, we will need to select the center vertex, Control plus, grows the selection, do that twice to get to there, one more to get to there. That can be add another group, tree inner, assign that to a value of 1. Now, same thing on the sides. If we were to add a couple of loops in, these we don't need. But again, make sure this one is removed from tree inner, so we don't get the inner part of the tree, have the displacement go all the way over the sides. We can then, one more step, the UV unwrap, of course. Control plus 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 gets us those faces that we want. I am just going to do image new, okay, sure. drag in tree inner displace, which is what we're going to want to use. At the moment, the UV map for this top part hasn't been done, so all the vertices are jammed up the top. But if we do U, project from view, that'll take the faces we have and project them to this view here. If I was to do U, project from view, bounds, that'll do the same thing, but make sure it hits the bounds of our one-to-one UV space. So that will give us that there. Tab back into object mode, and we've still got the sides. So because we have these two vertex groups, we can go modifier, add another displacement modifier on top of this. Set this to only affect tree inner. Strength, going to want closer to 0.05. At the moment it's set to the normals, which is why on the edges we're getting a bit of fuzzy inflatedness. We can change that to only be in the Z axis, so only displace up and down. And then if we were to add a new texture, bark displace 001, which we actually want to be tree inner displace, which doesn't exist yet. So now if we go to our texture settings, we've got, this is the texture in this first displace modifier, this is the texture in the second displace modifier. We want to edit that one. Now for this image here, if we were to just clear the reference to that, go there, tree inner displace, and so now we've got our two parts of that there. That might still be displaced a bit much, so if we go to our modifiers, 0.025, just halve that. Alt H to unhide our anvil. Probably do with scaling the anvil in a little bit, because we'll just check with our reference image. Bring that up so it sits on top. Make sure we apply the scale. Similarly, we haven't applied the scale to the tree stump. If we're to do that now, that's going to change the values on the displacement map, which is why it's always good to make sure that the values are zeroed out, or return to a value of 111 by doing Control A, apply scale, as soon as possible, to make sure all modifiers are acting as they should be. So this is going to need to be 0.005, and this one will be more like 0.02. And one more thing, to set that to the UV coordinates, not the local, which is why the texture on top has gone a bit funny. So in terms of high poly subdivision surface modeling, there are a few different ways to tackle things. Displacement maps are very common within ZBrush and sort of animation for film and cartoons. The displacement mapping can help get you a fair bit of detail at this stage, because this is actual displaced geometry. If we were to make our low res tree stump on top of that, anything that's coming through in the displacement map would bake through into the normal map, which we can then use in the game engine on our low res mesh. Similarly, there would be accurate ambient occlusion generated from this, and all the other sort of maps we regularly use can be generated from something that's been displaced. However, you don't have to use displacement mapping. This has been a practical overview of subdivision surface modeling, so having a lower res mesh, applying a subdivision surface modifier to it, and then defining which edges should have a certain amount of crease to them. It doesn't have to be a crease of 1 or a crease of nothing. Edge crease, edges, right click, edge crease. If I was to type in 0.5, that would pinch it in a little bit but still have some smoothness to it. So it can be any sort of combination of those. But again, to clear it, right click edge crease, -1 will clear it completely. So that is a recap of the practical from week 5.